It all began with a whisper, a soft, almost inaudible voice calling out to me from the shadows of my room. I had just moved into my new apartment, and everything seemed perfect. The walls were fresh with a coat of paint. The air smelled of new beginnings, and the bed was comfortable enough to sink into after a long day's work. Yet that night, something was different. Something was waiting for me in the darkness. I tried to ignore it, rolling over to face the wall and pull the blanket tighter around me. I had always been the type of person who believed in the rational in the real world. But that night, something inside me trembled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I must have eventually fallen asleep, but what followed was unlike any dream I had ever had before. It wasn't the usual hazy, fragmented visions I was accustomed to. This was different. This was too real. The dream began in the same room I was lying in. I could feel the coldness of the walls, the warmth of my bed, and yet everything felt off. The shadows seemed deeper, like they were alive, shifting and moving with purpose. As I sat up, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the room. Tall, thin, its features obscured by darkness. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me. It was watching, waiting. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure took a step closer, its presence so overwhelming that I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick with dread. "Help me," a voice whispered from the darkness, so faint it could have been a figment of my imagination. But it felt real, too real. Suddenly, I was back in my bed. The nightmare had ended, or so I thought. I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the room still and silent. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a soft light through the window, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't stop hearing the whisper, the voice that had followed me into the waking world. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just a dream, nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had felt it, the presence, the figure. The next night, I couldn't escape it. The nightmare returned, even more vivid than before. But this time, it wasn't just in the dream. The figure was standing by my bed when I woke up, its face inches from mine, its cold breath chilling my skin. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. I lay there, unable to speak, unable to comprehend what was happening. The lines between dream and reality were beginning to blur, and I didn't know where one ended and the other began. The days that followed felt like a blur. I tried to go about my life, work, eating, sleeping, but nothing felt normal anymore. That first night, the nightmare had shaken me. The second night, it had terrified me. But the third night was when everything changed. I had grown used to the presence in my room, the feeling of being watched. But this time, it was different. I was no longer just dreaming. The nightmare had followed me out of the sleep, into the waking world. I could feel it. I could hear it. Started in the same way, me, lying in bed, my body heavy with exhaustion. But this time, my mind was racing. I couldn't seem to stop thinking about the figure that had haunted my dreams. The tall, thin shadow that loomed over me, its faceless presence pressing against my thoughts like a vice. As I lay in bed, the room felt colder than usual. The walls seemed to stretch and groan, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I could hear the faint whisper again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the darkness of the corner. It was coming from inside my own mind, a voice that was both familiar and strange, like it had always been there, waiting for me to listen. "Help me," it whispered again, closer this time. I sat up abruptly, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, but I could see the outlines of furniture in the dim light coming from the street below. My eyes scanned the room, searching for the figure. The air felt thick, as if it was holding its breath. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, near the window, I could make out the shape of a figure. Tall, thin, its features obscured in the shadows, just like before. But this time, it wasn't just standing still. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, as if it was circling me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The nightmare had bled into reality, and I was trapped. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming clearer, though still shrouded in darkness. The closer it got, the more I could feel the weight of its presence, pressing down on me like a physical force. I could hear its breath now, low and raspy, like it was struggling to speak. "Do you see me?" The voice rasped. I wanted to answer, but no words would come. I couldn't understand it. The figure, the voice, it was all too much. Without warning, it lunged forward, its hands outstretched as if to grab me. But I didn't feel it. Instead, everything around me seemed to shift. The room started to twist and contort, the walls stretching, the floor sinking beneath me. Couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, I woke up. The room was still quiet. The early morning light was creeping through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. But my heart was still racing, my body drenched in sweat. I sat up, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It had felt so real, so vivid. But how? It was just a dream, wasn't it? I glanced around the room, expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. The room was empty, silent. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to fall asleep again. The nightmares were no longer confined to the night. They were seeping into my waking hours, twisting my perception of reality. I couldn't tell what was real anymore, and that thought, that terrifying thought, was enough to make my skin crawl. The following days felt like a blur, but not in the way I was used to. My life was no longer ordinary. The boundaries between my nightmares and reality had shattered, and now I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. I tried to go about my daily routine, work, shopping, even meeting friends, but everything felt different. The shadows followed me wherever I went. The whispers lingered just out of earshot. I began to feel like a stranger in my own skin. Something inside me was shifting. The fear, the confusion, it was all starting to consume me. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure, to the voice that had haunted my dreams. I was starting to question whether I was losing my mind, but deep down I knew it was real. One evening, after a long day at work, I returned to my apartment, my heart heavy with the weight of exhaustion. I couldn't escape it. The whispers followed me home, echoing in the corners of my mind. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired, that it was all in my head. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. The silence was oppressive, like the room was holding its breath. I locked the door behind me and set my bag down, but something made me pause. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The same cold, unnatural feeling that had haunted me since that first night crept over me again. I hesitated before turning on the lights. I had learned by now not to trust the dark corners of my apartment, but I forced myself to move, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. Nothing had happened since that last nightmare, so maybe it was all just my imagination. As I flipped the switch, the room flickered to life, but the shadows remained. They seemed deeper, more alive than before. My heart raced as I glanced around. The familiar objects in my apartment, The couch, the TV, the bookshelf suddenly seemed foreign, as if they didn't belong. Then I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the hallway. It was barely a whisper, but it was there. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned toward the hallway. The sound grew louder, like footsteps, but they weren't coming from anywhere. They were coming from everywhere. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor creaked under an unseen weight. I wasn't alone. My body went cold, and for a moment, I stood frozen, my eyes wide with fear. Then I heard the whisper again, clearer this time. "Help me." It was the same voice, the one that had haunted me in my nightmares. But this time it was closer. I could feel it right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening? I couldn't understand it. The boundaries between dream and reality were collapsing, and I was losing control. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, and I realized that it wasn't just in my mind. It was coming from the very walls, the very air around me. The figure had followed me, and it wasn't going to leave until it had what it wanted. I turned and ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. I had to escape whatever this was. But as I reached the front door, I froze again. The door was locked. I fumbled with the keys, but my hands were shaking too badly to unlock it. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices filling the air. I could hear them all now, voices crying out, begging for help. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air thick with their presence. And then I saw it, the figure. It was standing in the doorway of the living room, its tall, thin form barely visible in the dim light. Its face was still hidden, but its eyes were different. They glowed, burning with an unnatural light, and I could feel them piercing through me, seeing right into my soul. I backed away, my heart racing. The figure stepped forward, and the shadows followed it like a cloak. I could hear the faintest whisper, just above the noise in my head. "Come to me." I stumbled backward, panic rising within me. I had to get out. I had to escape. I turned and ran, throwing open the bedroom door and locking myself inside. I leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long time, I sat in the dark, trembling. The whispers had stopped, but I could still feel the presence in the apartment. It was waiting, watching, listening. I don't know how much time passed before I finally dared to sleep again. But when I did, I knew the nightmare would be waiting for me. This time, I wasn't sure if I could survive it. The nightmare didn't end when I woke up. It never did anymore. The moment my eyes fluttered open, I felt it. The weight of the darkness in the room, like something was watching me. I lay there, frozen in fear, listening to the silence. But the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful. It felt alive, almost like it was breathing, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I slowly sat up, my body stiff, my mind too tired to fight back. I had barely slept, and the terror from the previous night was still fresh in my bones. The whispers, the figure, the burning eyes. It all felt so real. But was it real, or had it all just been a nightmare? I couldn't tell anymore. I glanced around the room, trying to shake off the feeling of dread. The shadows were gone, but that didn't bring me any comfort. It felt like something was waiting for me, lurking just beyond my reach. I decided to leave the apartment for a while, to get away from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to be closing in on me. Maybe a walk outside would clear my head. But as I stepped out into the hallway, I was hit by an overwhelming sense of unease. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it was pressing down on me. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. The hallway was dark, despite the daylight creeping in through the windows. And that smell, something old, something musty, like the walls hadn't been touched in years, seemed to cling to the air. It made me feel nauseous. I forced myself to move, each step feeling like a battle. The closer I got to the stairwell, the more I felt the pull of something sinister behind me. It was like I was being drawn back to the apartment, as if something didn't want me to leave. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. I tugged at the handle, panic rising in my chest. The door was stuck. It felt as if something was holding it shut from the other side. I tried again, harder this time, but it wouldn't budge. I turned around, feeling the walls closing in, and I could almost hear the whisper in the back of my mind. "You can't escape." It was the same voice, the one I'd heard in my dreams. It was inside my head now, whispering to me, following me wherever I went. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. With a shaky breath, I turned back toward the apartment. I had to get back inside. I needed to figure out what was happening to me, what this thing was that had attached itself to me. When I got to the door, it opened easily. I stepped inside, feeling a strange sense of relief that I couldn't explain. But as soon as I crossed the threshold, something changed. The air in the apartment felt colder, sharper. The familiar surroundings now felt wrong. The living room seemed smaller, more cramped. The walls seemed to press in on me, the shadows deeper than before. And the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears. I turned around quickly, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The place was as still as death. Suddenly, I heard a loud bang from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. The sound was so sudden, so jarring, that it felt like the whole apartment had shaken. I stood there for a moment, paralyzed, unable to move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Then I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It was real. It came from the kitchen. "Come closer." I knew I shouldn't. I knew I should run, leave the apartment, get out of here. But something kept me rooted in place, as if the voice had control over me. Couldn't resist. Slowly, step by step, I made my way toward the kitchen. Each step felt like I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved as if they had a mind of their own. When I reached the kitchen, the door was slightly ajar. The room inside was shrouded in darkness, the shadows stretching across the floor like fingers reaching out to grab me. I pushed the door open with trembling hands and stepped inside. The kitchen looked the same as it always had, but something was off. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the walls were covered in dark stains that I didn't remember being there before. My eyes darted around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the sense of dread was overwhelming. Then I saw it. On the floor, in the center of the room, was a small, blood-stained object. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I stepped closer, my stomach churned with horror. It was a knife, its blade coated in thick, dark blood. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. How did it get here? I hadn't used it. I didn't have time to think any longer. The moment I took another step back, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned to face it, heart racing, my chest tightening with fear. I was trapped. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm. The figure, it was here in this room with me. I could feel it, its presence pressing against me from all sides. "You're mine now," it whispered, its voice like ice scraping across my skin. I backed away from the door, fear surging through me. The shadows moved, shifting and stretching, reaching toward me. couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was run. The door slammed shut with a force that made the entire kitchen tremble. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing, struggling to understand what was happening. I felt trapped, suffocated by the darkness closing in around me. The air was thick, as if I were breathing in the very essence of fear itself. The whispers, they were louder now, almost like they were coming from inside my own mind. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the fear that was slowly crushing me from the inside out. My hands shook as I reached for the door handle, but it was useless. The door wouldn't open. It was like something or someone was holding it shut, trapping me in this nightmare. I turned, looking around the room, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain this madness. The kitchen was just as I remembered it, but somehow it felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching and twisting like living creatures. I couldn't focus, couldn't think straight. All I could hear was the deafening rush of blood in my ears, the whispering voices growing louder and more frantic by the second. "You can't escape," one of the voices hissed. "You belong here." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I staggered back, knocking over a chair in the process. The sound of it hitting the floor was so loud in the silence, it felt like it echoed through my skull. My breathing was ragged, shallow, as I tried to make sense of it all. But nothing made sense. The dreams, the whispers, the feeling that I was being watched. It was all too much. I had to get out. I had to get out now. Frantically, I grabbed at the door again, pulling and pushing with all my strength. But it was useless. It didn't move. I fell to my knees, tears welling up in my eyes. How had it come to this? How had my life become this twisted nightmare? "Please," I whispered into the void, the words barely escaping my throat. "I just want to go home." The darkness seemed to listen, and for a moment, the whispers stopped. The room grew quiet. The tension in the air lifted, just enough for me to feel like I could breathe again. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't over. Something was coming, and it wasn't done with me yet. A sudden gust of wind blew through the kitchen, sending a chill across my skin. The windows were closed. There was no breeze, but the wind, it was real. The air was icy cold now, the kind of cold that numbed your bones and made you want to scream. And then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against the wood. It came from the other side of the room, from the dark corner where the shadows were thickest. My heart raced again, my mind screaming at me to run, to get away from whatever was lurking in that corner. But my feet were glued to the floor, unwilling to move, unable to move. The tapping grew louder, faster, and then I saw it. A figure, slowly emerging from the shadows, moving like a wraith, its form shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The air around it seemed to warp, bending and stretching as if reality itself couldn't hold its shape. My breath caught in my throat, and I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure drew closer, its face hidden beneath a cloak of darkness. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them on me. Cold, empty, and watching. It stepped forward, and the floor creaked beneath its weight. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to escape. The whispers returned, louder than before, surrounding me from every direction. "Why are you here?" the voice from the figure rasped. It was low and guttural, like it was speaking from the depths of hell itself. "You shouldn't have come." Couldn't breathe. The air was suffocating, and the cold was unbearable. My skin prickled with fear as I backed away from the figure, but there was no way out, no way to escape the nightmare. I never meant to. I started, my voice shaking, but I couldn't finish. My mind was racing, and all I could think about was the way the figure was moving, slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. "You will never leave," the figure whispered, its voice like ice slicing through my soul. I felt the darkness close in around me, its tendrils reaching for me like hands, pulling me into its grip. I struggled, but it was no use. I was drowning in the fear, suffocated by the shadows. The whispers became a roar in my ears, deafening, maddening. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figure was gone. The room was silent again. The door to the kitchen was wide open. I stood there, trembling, my heart thudding in my chest. Was it gone? Was I really free? But deep down, I knew I wasn't. This wasn't over. I had only just begun to scratch the surface of the nightmare that had taken root in my life. And as I turned to leave, I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't the house that was haunted. It was me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Even as I stepped out of the kitchen and into the hallway, the house was eerily quiet now, but the silence was suffocating. My footsteps echoed in the empty space, bouncing off the walls, making me feel like I was not alone. I looked around. The house seemed normal again, too normal. The creaky wooden floors, the faded wallpaper, the old furniture that I had become so accustomed to. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew that whatever was haunting me, whatever I had woken up to in this nightmare, was still here. I wanted to leave. I needed to leave. But where could I go? This was my home now, wasn't it? A house that seemed perfect at first, but now felt like a prison. The air was thick with tension, and every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the floorboards seemed too deliberate, like the house itself was alive and aware of my presence. I walked slowly, carefully, my hand brushing against the walls as I moved. Suddenly, a low, soft whisper echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It was so quiet at first, almost like I had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. The words were barely audible, but I could hear them clearly. "You can't escape." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, the same one I had heard before, the one that had haunted my dreams. But where was it coming from? It felt like it was all around me, inside my head, inside the walls. I turned, trying to pinpoint the source of the whisper, but there was nothing. The hallway stretched on in both directions, empty and dark, the dim light from the overhead bulb flickering faintly. "You belong here," the voice continued, now more urgent, more insistent. "This is your place. You will never leave." My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away from the walls. I had to get out. I had to find a way to break free from this nightmare that was swallowing me whole. But I didn't know where to go. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls narrowing, the floors shifting beneath my feet. I stumbled back toward the stairs, wanting to run to my room, to lock myself away from whatever was happening. But as I reached the top of the stairs, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement down the hallway. I froze. It was a shadow, long and stretched, moving as if it were alive, shifting with the rhythm of a heartbeat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. It was too dark to see clearly, but I could feel its presence. I could feel its eyes on me. "Come," the voice whispered again. "Come closer." It wasn't a command, it was an invitation, and it chilled me to my core. I tried to take a step forward, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to break free from the grip of whatever was in that hallway. My breath was shallow, my body trembling. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. But the whispering didn't stop. It was louder now, clearer. It was as if the very walls of the house were speaking to me, breathing with me. "You are not alone." I bolted back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my heart racing. I had to be losing my mind. There was no way this was real. No way a house could be alive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. This was happening. This was real. I looked around my room, desperate for something to hold on to, but everything seemed wrong. The furniture, the walls, even the window, nothing felt familiar anymore. It was like the house had changed overnight, like it was reshaping itself around me, adjusting to my fear. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to steady my breathing. What was going on? How could I make it stop? The whispers were still there, swirling around me, louder and louder. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the house, and I couldn't escape myself. The nightmare had followed me here. It wasn't just in my dreams, it was in my waking life now, too. I stumbled toward the window, hoping to see something that would reassure me. Anything to prove that this was just my imagination running wild. But when I looked outside, the world was different. The streets were empty, the houses dark. It was as if the entire neighborhood had disappeared, leaving only me and the house behind. The whispering grew louder. It filled the room now, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls were closing in, pressing on me from all sides. You will never leave. The voice was everywhere now. It was inside my head, inside my soul, repeating over and over again. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, anything, to break free from this nightmare. But as I turned toward the door to leave, I heard it. The faintest sound, barely audible but unmistakable. Tap. It was coming from the hallway again. I stood frozen, staring at the door. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, until it was a steady rhythm, a heartbeat. I didn't want to look, but I had no choice. I had to know what was happening. I slowly turned the doorknob and opened the door. The tap, tap, tap echoed louder in the silence of my room. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood frozen, my hands still gripping the door handle. The house seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. I slowly pushed the door open, just a crack, enough to peer into the dimly lit hallway. It was the same hallway I had been through countless times, but tonight it felt different. The shadows were deeper, the darkness thicker, as if the house itself was swallowing the light. I stepped into the hallway, my feet reluctant to move. The tapping had stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of silence that made you question everything. Every sound, every breath, every step. I turned toward the source of the tapping. It had come from the far end of the hallway, where the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The hallway stretched long and dark, the end of it hidden in shadow. The faintest flicker of movement caught my eye at the very end, and I froze. There, standing at the end of the hall, was a figure. It was tall, thin, and unnervingly still. I couldn't make out its face. It was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me. Cold, watching, waiting. My mind screamed at me to run, to turn around and get as far away from that figure as possible. But my body refused to move. It was like I was stuck in place, unable to break free from the grip of fear. The figure took a slow step forward. My breath hitched. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, like I was breathing underwater. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight, and no sound came out. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the figure had moved closer. It was now just a few feet away, and I could see it more clearly. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its clothes were torn, as if it had been wandering for years. But what chilled me the most were its eyes. They were empty, dark voids that seemed to pull me in, like they were looking right through me. My heart raced as it took another step forward. I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and frantic. But before I could move, the figure spoke. "Don't run," it said in a voice so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. It was the same voice I had heard in my dreams, the same whispers that had followed me through every waking moment. But this time, the voice was clear, sharp, and closer than ever. I tried to speak, to ask who or what it was, but my mouth was dry, my words trapped in my throat. The figure took another step closer, its face still hidden in the shadows. "You can't escape," it whispered. "This house is your home now." Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. I stumbled back, my hands reaching for something, anything, to steady myself. But there was nothing, just the cold, empty air around me. I felt the walls closing in again, like they were slowly shifting, moving closer. The very house seemed to be breathing, exhaling its dark presence all around me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. In that moment of panic, I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer with every passing second. But it wasn't the figure, it was something else. Something worse. I turned toward the source of the noise, but the hallway was empty. No figure, no shadow, just the oppressive, suffocating darkness. But the footsteps kept coming, growing louder, closer. I stumbled back toward the door of my room, my legs shaking, my mind racing. I had to get out. I had to leave. But when I reached for the door handle, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. The house was locking me in. My breath became shallow as I pounded on the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't give. The footsteps were louder now, and I could feel the weight of them in the air, like something or someone was coming for me. I turned around, desperate to find another way out, but the hallway had changed. The walls were closer, the shadows darker, and at the end of the hall, the figure stood waiting again. Its eyes were wide open now, staring straight at me, and the whispering voice echoed in my ears. "You cannot leave." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I was trapped. The house had me, and there was no escape. The air around me felt thick, like I was trapped in a dream I couldn't escape. My heart raced as I backed away from the figure at the end of the hall. Each step felt like it was in slow motion, my feet heavy, as if the house itself was pulling me back. I glanced at the door, still locked, mocking me with its unyielding presence. There was no way out. I was completely at the mercy of whatever was in this house. The footsteps, still echoing through the hallway, grew louder, closer. My mind screamed at me to wake up, to escape, but the nightmare had already consumed me. I wasn't sure if I was still asleep, or if this was reality. The figure at the end of the hall took another step toward me, its pale face now fully visible. The emptiness in its eyes sent a chill straight through my bones. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just watched as it moved closer, the sound of its footsteps like the ticking of a clock, each one closer to my end. "You can't escape me," the figure whispered, its voice growing louder in the silence. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, misting in the heavy stillness. The figure stopped just a few feet from me, its cold eyes never leaving mine. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what it wanted from me, but the words didn't come. My throat was tight, like I was choking on the fear that gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body refused to obey. The house felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, darkening the hallway, swallowing the light. I could feel the weight of it, the house, the figure, the nightmare, pressing down on me, pushing me toward the edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in the brief moments of light, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the far end of the hall, the door to the attic slowly creaked open. A rush of cold air swept through the house, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. I didn't know where the door would lead, but I couldn't stay here. Not with that thing standing in front of me. Not with the house itself coming alive, trying to suffocate me. Without thinking, I ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I sprinted toward the open attic door, the figure's whispers following me like a shadow. "Don't go up there. It's too late." I ignored the voice, pushing myself harder. I reached the stairs to the attic, stumbling slightly as I ascended, my breath ragged. I needed to get away. I needed to escape this nightmare. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I stopped. The attic was dark, darker than it had ever been before. The room seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the walls were closing in on me. In the center of the room was an old mirror, covered in a thick layer of dust. It wasn't there before. It wasn't part of this house, yet somehow, it felt like it had always belonged. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The mirror seemed to shimmer with an eerie light, like something was moving inside of it. And then I saw it, a reflection of myself. But it wasn't me. The figure in the mirror was different. Its face was twisted, its eyes black as coal, and its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. It reached out, pressing its hand against the glass, as if trying to come through. I stepped back, my heart racing, but the figure in the mirror moved with me, never breaking its gaze. It raised its hand again, and in the reflection, its fingers began to press against the glass, cracking it. Crack, crack, the mirror was breaking. I turned to run, but before I could take a single step, the sound of footsteps behind me froze me in place. I slowly turned around, dreading what I would see. There, standing in the doorway of the attic, was the figure. It was taller now, its eyes black voids that seemed to pull me in. The darkness around it seemed to grow, stretching out like tendrils, reaching toward me. "You're not going anywhere," it whispered, its voice a hiss that made my skin crawl. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, my body paralyzed by fear. The figure took a slow step forward, and with each movement, the room seemed to darken further, the shadows swallowing the light. The mirror behind me shattered, the sound sharp and final. The glass splintered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shards. But before I could make sense of it, the figure lunged at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable, but nothing happened. I opened my eyes slowly, and to my shock, I was back in my bed. I sat up, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over, right? But when I looked around, I realized something. The room was exactly the same as it had been in the nightmare. The same shadows, the same cold, suffocating air. And then I saw it. On the wall, a crack in the wall that wasn't there before. I stood up, my legs trembling. The house had never been like this. It wasn't real. This wasn't real. Couldn't be. But as I reached out to touch the crack, the shadows in the room shifted. The house was alive. The nightmare was just beginning.